At daybreak on February 10, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thach stood at the helm of a desperate struggle in the blue expanse over Wake Island. His eyes scanned the horizon where 6 agile Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters were diving swiftly toward his squadron of 4 FF-4F Wildcats. The grim reality was clear. His men had only about 90 seconds before the deadly clash would decide who would live and who would die. Thach was no rookie. At 37 years old, with 214 flight hours logged in Wildcats, he had yet to score a single kill against those merciless Zeros. The enemy planes held every advantage: faster climb rates, tighter turns, and unmatched agility at virtually any altitude. Every calculation pointed to the same brutal truth. American Wildcats were outmatched. A Zero's turn radius was such that it could outmaneuver a Wildcat in just 14 seconds, enough time to slip onto a Wildcat's tail, line up the guns, and unleash death. In the months leading up to that day, the cost of these aerial duels was mounting. The Pacific Fleet had lost more than 40 Wildcats in one-on-one fights, along with their brave pilots. The pattern was hauntingly familiar. American pilots, trained to turn and fight, would engage a Zero only to be outturned and shot down. 43 funerals had followed the same grim scenario by February 1942. Commands kept issuing orders to avoid turning engagements and flee when possible. But running meant deserting comrades to enemy fire. No pilot wanted to be the one who fled, leaving others exposed. Thach commanded Fighting Squadron 3, a tight-knit band of 4 men and 4 Wildcats, each trusting him for the grim task of surviving the zero-sum game of sky combat. Yet, he carried the bitter knowledge that there was no current answer to the superiority of the Zero. No maneuver, no tactic had yet changed the deadly math. 3 days earlier, in a quiet room at Naval Air Station San Diego, Thach wrestled with the problem. He stared at a small box of wooden matches sent by his wife, a simple, ordinary gift amid the war's chaos. As his fingers traced the slender sticks, a revelation began to form. What if 2 Wildcats didn't fight as lone wolves but moved together as one, weaving back and forth, supporting each other just like those matches crossing paths? This simple mental image overturned everything Thach thought he knew about fighter combat. Since the dawn of aerial warfare, the unspoken rule was clear. Once combat started, fighters scattered to engage independently, a brutal test of individual skill against superior foes. But these weaving matches suggested a radical strategy. 2 fighters moving in a synchronized pattern, turning toward each other to cover one another's blind spots and trap an enemy pilot into the line of fire of the wingman. It sounded insane. It violated every dogma, every page of the Navy manual. But it was born of desperation and the bitter necessity to keep men alive, thousands of miles from home, facing a foe that refused to lose. That night, Thach summoned his wingman, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare, to share the vision. He showed O'Hare the matches, explained the weave concept without embellishment. 2 aircraft crossing paths, protecting each other by sharp, coordinated turns. O'Hare, a young, sharp-minded aviator, absorbed the idea quickly and asked the question that sealed their fate. When do we test it? The answer came fast. Days later, into the thundering skies above the Pacific, the first test of that matchstick weave would begin. Not in a training exercise, but in the heat of battle, against the relentless Zero fighters that had already claimed too many American lives. What happened next would change the course of naval aviation forever. 4 days after that quiet evening in San Diego, Lieutenant Commander John Thach found himself back in the roaring skies above the Pacific, ready to put his bold new idea to the ultimate test. The morning sun cast long shadows over Wake Island as he and 3 trusted wingmen readied their F-4F Wildcats. 4 planes, 4 men bonded by trust and a shared hope of surviving the brutal combat to come. Ahead of them, like hawks ready to strike, 6 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros cut through the thinner air at 11,000 feet. The Zeros were closing fast, 200 yards from the Americans, diving steeply with the deadly precision that had so often spelled death for Wildcat pilots. The odds were daunting. 4 Wildcats numbered against 6 nimble Zeros, each enemy fighter faster, more maneuverable, and with more combat experience. Under doctrines etched deeply into their training since 1918, fighter pilots would have split up, broken formation, and engaged the enemy one-on-one, each pilot hoping to outfly, outgun the opposing foe. But Thach had one order, one last chance to rewrite history. "Weave on my mark," his voice cut through the radio static, steady but urgent. His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, was positioned 800 feet to his right, with 2 more Wildcats, piloted by Ensign Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Colson, flying slightly further behind. They formed a loose line, all watching, all waiting for the command that would change their fate. The Zeros lurched closer. Thach keyed his mic again. "Bassett, on me. Execute weave." Both turned sharply, Bassett's Wildcat turning toward Thach's, Thach's turning toward Bassett's. They flew directly at each other, a collision course that Japanese pilots likely mistook for panic or a deadly error about to unfold. But this was no accident. It was the Matchstick weave in motion, a figure-8 dance in the skies. At 400 yards, the 2 Wildcats banked hard, passing within 200 feet of each other, their paths intertwining perfectly like crossing threads. The Zeros, trained for single-target chases, faced a bewildering new threat. The lead Zero pilot locked onto Bassett's tail, confident, closing to 600 yards, ready to strike. He expected the same easy kill as before, but as Bassett turned sharply toward Thach instead of veering away, the hunter became prey. Thach, flying the other side of the weave, came screaming into the Zero's line of fire. The Japanese pilot stared into the barrels of a Wildcat's 50 caliber machine guns firing at a blistering rate, 70 rounds per second, tearing into the Zero's engine cowling. Smoke poured out as the Zero pilot had a terrible choice: break off or fly headlong into the hailstorm of bullets. He broke off, pulling hard right and climbing desperately. The other 5 Zeros scattered, surprised, uneasy. Sheedy and Colson, watching intently, recovered from their initial shock and dove into the same weaving pattern. The next Zero pilot attacked Colson's tail, closing to 400 yards, but Sheedy's timely arrival through the weave forced the Zero into retreat. The 6-minute dogfight, a breathtaking and brutal ballet of death and survival, ended with all 4 Wildcats still flying, none lost, none seriously hit. Back on Ford Island, the pilot's hands shook, not from fear, but adrenaline and the dawning realization. The weave had worked. The simple crossing pattern, inspired by 2 wooden matches on a desk, had beaten superior Japanese tactics for the first time in the Pacific battle skies. In the aftermath, Thach filed his detailed combat report, describing the weave, how it worked, and urging for its immediate adoption fleet-wide. The response was cautious. "Interesting tactic, needs further testing," read the reply. But for Thach, for those pilots, and for the 43 funerals marking the loss of pilots to the Zero's deadly advantage, this was no time for more waiting or testing. The Matchstick weave had proven itself in the crucible of combat. It was time to fight smarter, or die trying. Within days of that pivotal dogfight over Wake Island, Whispers of the Wildcats' unconventional maneuver began circulating among the squadron pilots. Thach's bold gamble, coined later as the Thach weave, had demonstrated a revolutionary approach, fighting in coordinated pairs, weaving in and out of each other's paths to outmaneuver the inherently faster and more agile Zero fighters. The success was undeniable. Thach's squadron returned to base victorious, but more importantly, with a new confidence. Their survival rate had shot up dramatically, and the myth of Japanese invincibility was cracking in the minds of American pilots. But the real challenge was yet to come, convincing the higher command to implement this unorthodox tactic across the vast Pacific Fleet. The months that followed saw the tactic's rigorous testing and refinement. Thach returned to the training grounds and debrief rooms, meticulously teaching his fellow pilots the pattern. Each briefing, each demonstration flight, drew the same question from skeptical commanders and seasoned veterans. Can this work when the enemy is coordinated? When they come in larger numbers? Or when they're determined to break the weave? Thach's answers came with every successful engagement. By the time the Battle of Midway loomed, the Thach weave was already gaining traction in secret among the most forward-looking pilots. They understood that in the brutal, unpredictable chaos of aerial combat, only innovation could level the odds. Against them, the Japanese had amassed a formidable force. 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and a swarming mass of Zeros that outperformed American fighters in speed, climb, and agility. Midway's impending assault was a showdown, a test of tactics, courage, and ingenuity. Thach's squadron was assigned to safeguard the USS Yorktown and the vital air operations over the island. The pilots meticulously practiced the weave, flying in pairs, crossing paths, forcing the enemy into deadly trapping maneuvers that could turn the battlefield into a playground of death for the attacker. As the dawn broke on June 4, 1942, it was clear that the Japanese meant business. Their first wave of dive bombers and Zeros surged towards the American fleet in an enveloping attack. Thach's pilots, many trained in the weave, stood ready, their eyes sharp, hearts pounding with anticipation of what would come. They knew the Japanese would adapt just as swiftly. When the Zeros appeared, descending from the dawn sky with deadly intent, the fighters deployed their new tactics. From high above, Thach and his wingmen executed the crossing pattern flawlessly, forcing the enemy to react. The Japanese pilots, experienced as they were, perceived the American fighters' unorthodox movement as chaos. But beneath that chaos was a calculated strategy, one that minimized the Wildcats' vulnerabilities and maximized their survivability. The first encounters were tense, fierce. The Japanese, confused by the unpredictable weaving, tried to split their attacks from multiple directions. Some Zeros attempted head-on dives, while others sought to isolate and outmaneuver the Wildcats. But thanks to the tactics Thach had developed, the American pilots responded with a relentless rhythm, turning into each other, crossing paths, and trapping the enemy in deadly crossfire. In one critical engagement, Thach himself chased a Zero into a head-on crossing. As the Zero committed to his tail, Thach turned sharply into him, guns blazing. The Zero exploded in a cloud of smoke, a victory that confirmed that the weave could turn the tide. By the end of the day, the Japanese forces realized that their traditional tactics were failing. What had worked so often before was no longer effective. The American fighters, masters of the weave, had shot down several Zeros and had kept their own losses minimal. News of this innovation spread rapidly among naval commanders and pilots. Once the tactic proved its worth in the heat of the Midway battle, It became a standard operating procedure. The advantages were clear. Pilots could engage confidently even when outnumbered. They could force the enemy into mistakes. And, most critically, their survival chances increased exponentially. The Thach weave was more than a technique. It was a revolution in aerial combat philosophy. It epitomized the essence of adaptive warfare. Unorthodox, tested in the crucible of battle, and immediately effective. As the war raged on, this small packet of matches in San Diego had forever altered the face of fighter tactics and saved countless lives across the Pacific.
As the Thach weave took hold within the Pacific Fleet, it was not just American pilots who noticed this new defensive tactic. Japanese commanders, masters of their own craft, began analyzing the sudden shift in the air battles. The simple crossing pattern that had shattered their dominance at Midway was now a puzzle that demanded a solution. They began training their pilots specifically to counter this weave, determined to regain the lethal edge they had once wielded with ease. The first real test of this Japanese counter came on June 23, 1942, above the skies of Santa Cruz Island. Fighting Squadron 3, Thach's unit, was escorting a convoy when radar detected 18 incoming bogies, hostile aircraft closing fast from the northwest. Thach counted his squadron carefully. 8 Wildcats, paired as 4 two-man units, all prepared to execute the now official weave maneuver. But the Japanese attack defied previous patterns. Instead of an immediate dive, the enemy circled at altitude for a full 90 seconds, a behavior that struck Thach as unusual and calculating. The Zeros were coordinating, splitting into 3 groups to attack simultaneously from high, left, and right flanks. This 3-directional assault was designed to overwhelm the protective crossing pattern that worked so well against single- or 2-direction attacks. As the attack unfolded, panic rippled through the American pairs. Pilots faced multiple threats from different angles. In the chaos, squadron members hesitated and fragmented, abandoning the weave to fight independently, the very outcome the Japanese had aimed for. The lone fighters became easy targets, but Thach's voice rang out over the radio, commanding discipline and focus. Reform pairs. Lock onto your wingman. Execute standard weave. Ignore the other groups. Slowly, the Wildcats regained form. Despite facing coordinated attacks on 3 fronts, the pairs executed the weave with fiery precision. Zeros pursuing one Wildcat suddenly found themselves in the crosshairs of another. The results were striking. 2 enemy fighters were shot down from the high-altitude group. Another 2 were destroyed when the left and right flanking groups attacked the remaining pairs. The attack lasted 8 intense minutes, after which the Japanese retreated, having lost 5 Zeros without downing a single Wildcat. Though the Japanese counter-strategy had failed, the engagement was a stark warning. The enemy was studying the weave closely and evolving tactics to neutralize it. For Thach and his men, this was a reminder that aerial combat was a deadly game of adaptation. Today's innovation would be tomorrow's target. 3 days later, Thach delivered a detailed combat report, describing the coordinated triple attack, how the weave held under pressure, and urged immediate and wide adoption of the tactic throughout the Pacific Fleet. This report reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, who forwarded it to Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. King was impressed by the statistics, the kill ratio, the survival rates, and began pushing for formal recognition of the weave as essential fleet doctrine. In late June 1942, the Thach weave was officially mandated across the Pacific Fleet. Fighter squadrons were ordered to train rigorously, adopt the pattern in all engagements, and no longer rely on outdated doctrine that had cost so many lives. Yet,
The hardest test was still to come. The war in the Pacific was far from over, and the Japanese would continue refining their tactics. It was now a contest of wits, courage, and relentless innovation, one in which survival would depend on the ability to evolve faster than the enemy. Thach, ever the instructor and innovator, prepared to take his knowledge and experience to the wider fleet, ready to turn raw recruits into pilots who could survive and win against any skyward threat. The fate of countless men and the course of the war depended on making the weave harder to crack, more precise, and more deadly. The story of the youth who saw 2 wooden matches weaving on a San Diego desk and turned it into a lifeline for American aviators was only just beginning.
As July rolled around in 1942, the Pacific War had entered a brutal new phase, with the fight for Guadalcanal raging fiercely. The island's tiny airfield, Henderson Field, was the gateway. Whoever controlled the skies there controlled the survival of ground forces and supply lines below. Wildcat pilots found themselves engaged in constant, deadly combat against waves of Zero fighters determined to reclaim air superiority for the Japanese. Yet, not every pilot had embraced the Thach weave. Despite orders and briefings, some groups clung to older methods. Fighter duels fought solo, relying on individual skill in lethal one-on-one dogfights that so often ended in tragedy. On a crisp morning over Guadalcanal, 12 Wildcat fighters from 6 different squadrons climbed into the sky to patrol the airspace. 4 pilots trained in the weave, 8 still flying by the old, risky rules. At exactly 11:20 a.m., a squadron of 32 Zeros appeared overhead, a terrifying force aimed to overwhelm whoever dared challenge their dominance. The contrast in tactics was striking. The 4 pilots trained in the weave paired off instantly, their wings interlocking in the deadly figure-8 pattern. The 8 who ignored the new tactic scattered, each on their own desperate hunt against superior opponents. What followed was a brutal and telling encounter. Within 22 harrowing minutes, 6 Wildcats were shot down. Every single one had rejected the weave tactic, struggling against the superior maneuverability of the Zeros, isolated and outnumbered in fatal dogfights. Meanwhile, the 4 pilots dancing through the sky with the weave survived without a scratch. Their timing, precision, and mutual protection fended off the overwhelming force. Even more remarkable, those 4 pilots combined had shot down 7 Japanese Zeros between them, a kill count higher than any group that day flying solo. The stark realities laid bare. The old ways meant certain death. The new tactics meant survival and victory. Word of this engagement spread quickly, reaching the ears of Admiral William Bull Halsey and other high-ranking commanders. The report was clear and unambiguous. Every fighter pilot, in every squadron, had to master the weave within 2 weeks or face the devastating consequences. With urgency, training programs ramped up across Guadalcanal. Thach himself flew to the island and stayed for 3 weeks, relentlessly drilling pilots. Forewarned of the cost of hesitation, he conducted morning briefings, afternoon flight drills, and evening debriefs. He showed them the matches, drew diagrams on every available blackboard, and performed life-saving demonstrations in the air. Different pilots adapted at different speeds. Some caught on within 2 days. Others labored for a week under the strain of high-speed, high-risk maneuvers. But all learned to turn toward their wingmen, weave in the deadly pattern, and trust the protection it offered. By August, nearly 100 pilots were weaving in combat formations. By the following month, that number had more than doubled. The spread of the weave was not just a tactical shift. It was a cultural change, turning lone combatants into coordinated teams capable of surviving impossible odds. The results were immediate. The kill ratio of American pilots improved dramatically as the weave became doctrine.
The once dreaded Japanese Zeros found themselves facing a new kind of opponent, one who was unpredictable, coordinated, and deadly. This pivotal moment marked the turning point in the air war over the Pacific. With the Thach weave, American pilots were no longer simply outmaneuvered prey. They were fighters with a fighting chance, thanks to the vision of one man and the courage of those who embraced the matchstick tactic that saved lives and shaped history.
By the end of July 1942, the undeniable success of the weave in combat compelled the higher echelons of the Pacific Fleet to pay close attention. Admiral Chester Nimitz, himself recognizing the critical impact this tactic had on pilot survival rates and combat effectiveness, ordered thorough evaluations. Thach was summoned to Pearl Harbor to formally present his findings to senior naval commanders, including Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. Thach's briefing was comprehensive and persuasive. He laid out the data, survival rates, kill ratios, and tactical diagrams. Using combat footage and pilot testimonials, he demonstrated how the weave had transformed dogfights from deadly isolation into coordinated defense. For the first time, American pilots were not just fighting to survive, but fighting to dominate. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, some in the Navy remained cautious. Innovation, even one as promising as the weave, rarely moved swiftly through rigid military bureaucracy. Concerns about coordination, pilot training time, and adherence to established doctrines slowed formal approval. In the meantime, the Japanese were not idle. Intercepted radio communications revealed that Japanese squadron leaders were analyzing the weave and developing countermeasures. They issued strict orders. Do not commit to tail chases against American Wildcats, avoid predictable attack patterns, and if caught in the weave, disengage instead of pursuing. This shift marked a new phase in the air war, a deadly chess match where tactics shifted like quicksilver, each side adapting to the other's moves in real time. Back in the Pacific headquarters, the pressure on Thach and his squadron was immense. Every engagement was a test of survival and adaptation, but the results continued to favor the weave. Over the months, more squadrons began training intensively in the pattern, embedding it into their combat routines. On June 29, 1942, the breakthrough came. Admiral King issued Fleet Order 41-1942, mandating that all fighter squadrons in the Pacific Fleet adopt the Thach weave as the standard combat tactic. Training was to be mandatory, execution expected in every engagement. This marked a turning point. The matchstick tactic that once seemed like a desperate innovation was now the official doctrine. A lifeline stretched across the Pacific, saving hundreds of lives and setting the stage for American air dominance. The transition wasn't instantaneous. Orders needed to ripple through fleets. Pilots across islands and carriers needed training, and old habits had to be broken. But the momentum was unstoppable. By late summer, the weave was everywhere, on aircraft carriers' decks, in the skies over Guadalcanal, and beyond. Wildcat and later fighters like the P-38 Lightning and P-40 Warhawk adopted the maneuver, adapting its principles to their own strengths and challenges. Even bomber formations learned to use weaving patterns defensively. Thach's innovation had transcended its humble origins. The simple crossing of two matches on his desk had ignited a revolution in aerial warfare, saved scores of pilots, and changed the course of the Pacific War. With persistence, courage, and vision, a desperate tactic born of necessity became a cornerstone of U.S. naval air combat. As the fleet trained and fought through the rest of 1942, the kill ratio shifted dramatically. Before the weave, Americans shot down fewer than half as many Zeros as they lost Wildcats, 0.44 to 1.
After the WWII's adoption, this ratio flipped to over 2-to-1, a testament to the power of innovation when lives depended on it. Thach had not only devised a tactic, he had changed the future of fighter aviation forever.
As the months rolled into late 1942 and beyond, the lessons of the Thach WWII were repeatedly tested and proven under increasingly complex combat scenarios. Fighter pilots faced ever-evolving Japanese tactics, larger aerial battles, and new aircraft types. The maneuver's flexibility and fundamental principles allowed it to adapt to these changes, proving it was more than a fleeting innovation. It was a strategic revolution. One of the most critical moments came during the brutal clashes over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands in July 1942. A battle saw 32 Japanese Zeros attacking a dozen Wildcats from 6 squadrons. Of those Wildcats, only 4 pilots knew and executed the WWII pattern flawlessly, while the others fought independently in traditional dogfighting style. The result was stark and undeniable. All 6 Wildcats shot down were those flown by pilots who fought alone, while the 4 weaving pilots returned unscathed, claiming 7 zero kills among them. This outcome solidified the WWII's reputation as essential for survival and combat success. The success of the WWII soon attracted attention beyond the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Marine Corps and the Army Air Force began adopting the tactic, recognizing its effectiveness in increasing kill ratios and preserving American airmen's lives. Even the British Royal Navy pilots flying from carriers learned and incorporated the WWII into their own aerial tactics. The pattern had transcended service branches and national boundaries, becoming a foundational aerial combat technique among Allied forces. The tactic's core principle, 2 aircraft protecting each other by crossing paths and turning toward each other instead of away, became ingrained in training programs and combat doctrines. It was taught not just as a maneuver but as a mindset. Survive by fighting smarter, together. Japanese pilots continued to adapt, issuing warnings to avoid tail chases that led into the WWII's deadly crossfire. But the once feared Zero fighters found themselves outmatched, not by technological superiority, but by coordinated teamwork and tactical innovation. Speed and maneuverability were neutralized when pilots were forced to constantly react to crossing threat angles rather than dictating the fight. This period also saw the tactic improve, with variations tailored for different aircraft and combat speeds. Faster jet fighters of the Korean War era adapted the principles for supersonic engagements. The Vietnam War's F-4 Phantom pilots used a version called the Fluid 4, applying the WWII's core concept to even more complex aerial combat forms. John Thach's influence had thus rippled far beyond the initial matches on his desk or the skies of the Pacific. His WWII sparked a fundamental shift in air combat philosophy, stressing mutual support and unpredictability as keys to survival. The tactic continues to be taught in modern fighter pilot training programs, adapted yet fundamentally unchanged. From World War II's F-4F Wildcat to today's stealth fighters, the principles that Thach uncovered remain vital. Thach's story, from a moment of desperate innovation to a lasting legacy, humbles and inspires all who learn it. A testament to how one man's insight can save thousands of lives and alter the course of history. This is not just the story of a tactic. It's the story of human ingenuity triumphing over adversity in the skies of war. As the success of the WWII became undeniable, its influence extended far beyond the immediate battles of 1942. Thach's ingenuity inspired revolutionary shifts in aerial combat doctrine across all branches of the military, fundamentally altering how air power was projected in the years to come. During the subsequent campaigns in the Pacific and across other theaters, pilots trained extensively in the WWII's principles: pair formations, crossing paths, mutual support, becoming second nature in the chaos of aerial combat. The tactic's flexibility proved invaluable when facing new threats: faster jets, more advanced aircraft, and increasingly complex multiplane attacks. The victory at Midway was a watershed moment, not only because of the strategic victory, but because it validated the tactical principles Thach had pioneered. Naval aviators who employed the WWII scored numerous successes against the Japanese, turning what once was a gamble into a standard, dependable tactic. The ripple effects weren't confined to tactical doctrines. The success story of Thach and his matchsticks also influenced pilot training programs worldwide. Military academies and flight schools incorporated the WWII into their core curriculum, emphasizing coordination, communication, and adaptability, values now central to modern aerial combat. As years advanced, the WWII was adapted for different aircraft and evolving technologies. Jet fighters in the Korean War carried the principles into supersonic speeds, developing what was known as the Fluid 4, a dynamic, high-speed version of the original pattern. During the Vietnam War, the concept was further refined for multi-vessel operations, where complex formations coordinated to defend strike packages and evade enemy fighters. Thach's legacy extended further when the principle of coordinated team maneuvers became embedded in the ethos of air combat. The team-first mentality, mutual support, crossing paths in tight, unpredictable patterns, remains a pillar of modern fighter tactics. This approach has contributed to saving countless lives and gaining air superiority in some of the most dangerous conflicts. The story has even transcended military use. The core idea, cooperation, mutual support, and coordinated movement, has been adopted in civilian aviation, drone warfare, and even spaceflight operation protocols. Today, you can find memorials and museums honoring John Thach's extraordinary contribution. The Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola displays his original pack of matches, preserved in a glass case, an unassuming relic that sparked a tactical revolution. Pilots across the world remember the humble matchsticks that changed warfare, embodying the spirit of innovation born from desperation and driven by a relentless pursuit of survival. Thach's life and inventions serve as a timeless reminder. Even in the darkest hours, simple ideas, like crossing matchsticks, can forge a path toward victory, forever altering the course of history. While the Thach WWII changed the course of aerial combat, the man behind the tactic remained humble and dedicated to a larger mission: saving lives and strengthening naval aviation. After the intense periods of combat and training during World War II, John Thach's career took on new directions, reflecting his commitment to innovation and education. Post-war, Thach faced the choice between returning to civilian life or continuing his service in the Navy. Despite his personal longing for family and the comforts of home, he chose to stay, driven by the belief that his knowledge and experience were invaluable in preparing new generations of aviators. He was promoted steadily, reaching the rank of Rear Admiral by 1960, and undertook important commands, including carrier groups during the Korean War. Throughout, he remained dedicated to training pilots, refining tactics, and adapting air combat doctrines for changing technologies and theaters of war. His influence extended through the Korean and Vietnam Wars, where lessons from the Thach WWII evolved with supersonic jets and newer aircraft models. Thach's philosophy of mutual support, unpredictability, and coordination became a fundamental part of military aviation training programs across branches. Despite numerous awards, including the Navy Cross, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 3 Air Medals, Thach rarely sought the spotlight. He preferred to measure success by how many pilots returned safely from combat,
How many learned to protect themselves and their comrades in the sky? In interviews later in life, Thach framed his innovation as less about genius and more about sheer necessity. He often said, "It wasn't brilliance, it was desperation. I just wanted my boys to come home." Living quietly in San Diego after retiring in 1973 with the rank of 4-star admiral, he rarely spoke publicly about the war. Yet, each year on February 10th, the anniversary of that first combat use of the WWII, naval aviators across the country would call, share stories of survival, and thank the man who had quietly saved thousands. His legacy lives on in the halls of Naval Air Station Pensacola, where Thach Hall honors his contributions. His image and the motto, "Innovate, adapt, survive," inspire new generations of aviators training to fly missions today. John Thach passed away on April 15, 2001, at the age of 86. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by hundreds of naval aviators spanning multiple generations. From those who flew Wildcats in World War II to pilots of F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam and beyond. All owed a part of their survival and success to the man who looked at a simple pair of matches and envisioned a new way to fight. Thach's story is more than military history. It is a testament to how courage, creativity, and unwavering dedication can change the tide of war and preserve the lives of countless warriors. His Matchstick weave remains a symbol of hope, innovation, and the strength found in unity.
Long after the roar of engines faded and the battles ceased, the story of John Thach and his Matchstick weave lived on, not just in history books or pilots' training manuals, but as a living legacy etched into the very spirit of naval aviation. At the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, a simple glass case holds an extraordinary treasure. The original pack of wooden matches that first sparked the idea. Nestled beside a model of the F-4F Wildcat, these unassuming sticks are a silent testament to a breakthrough that saved more than 2,000 American pilots during World War II. School groups pass by every day, many unaware of the profound story behind these matches. But seasoned naval aviators pause, their eyes reflecting the weight of history and gratitude. To them, those matches represent innovation born from desperation, courage in the face of impossible odds, and the unyielding human drive to protect comrades in war. Across decades and conflicts, as jets replaced propellers and stealth entered the skies, the essence of the weave, the principle of two pilots protecting each other by turning toward one another, remains core to aerial combat training. Modern fighter tactics evolved from the same roots planted by Thach's simple but profound insight. Every year on February 10th, the anniversary of that first daring test over Wake Island, naval aviators reconnect with this legacy. They share stories, honor those who fell, and reaffirm the commitment to innovate, adapt, and survive. John Thach may have started with 2 wooden matches on a desk, but his vision wove a lifeline that stretched across battles, generations, and continents. It's a reminder that even amid the chaos of war, brilliance can be born from simplicity, and survival can come from teamwork and trust. This story is more than a tale of tactics and warplanes. It is about human connection, courage, and the enduring power of innovation to change the course of history, one matchstick at a time. Thank you for joining this journey through history. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share. Let these memories live on, not just as lessons from the past, but as inspirations for the future. Where are you watching from? Share your location and stories in the comments. You're part of keeping this legacy alive. Together, we remember, we honor,
and we carry forward the flame ignited by one man's matchsticks and the countless lives they saved.